Have a look at this map. Look closer. Look at Brooks Island, Connor's recovery site, Laci's recovery site, and the Berkeley Marina. What do you notice?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. It's easy to reach the point in the timeline where Laci and Connor's bodies finally washed ashore, tragically, in San Francisco Bay and basically say, there it is. There is the evidence that they were murdered. Well, we ought to have known this all along. What's more important to do now is reverse engineer the crime scene, and this is often what you can do as soon as you've got the human remains. Specifically, when you have them and where you have them, you can start reverse engineering the crime. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. If you think about it, the searchers ought to have known with a small boat like the one Scott was using. They should have known, and the small motor that he was using, and the fact that the day he took it out weren't the best conditions. The sea was rough, the bay was rough. Well, isn't it obvious that they couldn't have gone far, that he couldn't have gone far in that little vessel, and that the only reasonable destination, given what he was trying to do, is that he took it to the nearest island, the far side of Brooks Island. Why did he go there? Well, it would provide visual shielding in terms of line of sight from the shoreline on the other side. Scott's boat and the engine also tell you what sort of budget Scott really had to work with. It's not the sort of craft or engine that one would want to use in San Francisco Bay. A river or a lake, sure, but not a bay connected to the open sea. I mean, look at this thing. Look how dinky it is. And the detective, to his credit, asked Scott how far he went out, and the answer, as one would expect, was not very far. I think Scott was counting on one or two outcomes here. Number one, given that he made half a dozen or so anchors, and if he used chicken wire, I think he was counting on weighing down the remains so they would remain submerged permanently. And who knows, they may have been submerged permanently had it not been for particularly huge stormwaters, floodwaters that flooded into the bay in mid-April, basically dislodging the sediments, the remains from the anchors. Number two, I think the other outcome Scott anticipated was that by disposing of the bodies on the ocean side of the island, he was counting on the tides taking the remains out to sea, not back to shore. And I guess if they did end up on a shore, he probably figured they'd end up on the deserted Brooks Island. Nobody lived there. No one would stumble on them. Reverse engineering the location of the marina, the island, and the locations where the remains washed up, it's really not surprising at all. It's not surprising that Scott didn't get the boat very far out in the bay, especially that day. And it's not very surprising how near they were found to the marina where Scott launched from. Now let me ask you a question, and this is a test of how well you know this case and the details within this case. Was any blood evidence found? I mean, besides the smears in Scott's vehicle, any blood evidence found anywhere? The answer is that there were a few small spots of blood found on the comforter in the bedroom, and the blood belonged to Scott. Sharon Hagen, the criminal profiler that narrates some of Netflix's American Murder, Laci Peterson, believes Laci was strangled to death.
I believe that this was what I call a soft kill, that he either suffocated her or he strangled her.
I agree with the two reasons Hagen provides: quiet, and there's usually no blood evidence in terms of this whole idea of suffocation or strangulation. We had the same scenario in the Shanann Watts murder.
I think between the 23rd or the 24th, he wraps her in the tarp.
Many people, I think, believe Laci was killed close to when she disappeared on Christmas Eve morning, in other words, on the 24th. But I think she was killed much earlier the previous evening. I agree with the detective that Scott wrapped Laci in the tarp, possibly in the tarp and in chicken wire, or in chicken wire and then the tarp, but obviously not the tarp that was found at the home. That may have been used as an additional covering. It does make sense that he may have dragged Laci within this tarp or some other tarp over the tiled floor of the house to the door where the rug is scrunched up. Then he may have loaded her into the big green toolbox in his pickup at night when no one was about. Then he took Laci to the warehouse, backed the truck into the warehouse, put her in the boat, and then drove her to the bay. The part that I think beggars belief is once he's in the slipway, it would be the easiest thing in the world to just look into the boat, either from the perspective of passers-by on the pier, people just strolling by, or folks living in their boats, which basically line that marina like an endless phalanx of fishermen. And then you have a bulging blue tarp inside this boat that's easy to look into. Wouldn't people notice that? And so you're going to take the risk of people possibly seeing that, and then you could get caught out for murder. I do agree that he was trying to do the same thing Chris Watts tried to do, and arguably the killer of Kaylee Anthony as well. Just make them disappear forever. I remember when I wrote Blood and Seawater, one theory I was testing was whether Scott could have gone out into the bay not once but twice, once in secret, under the cover of night, sometime on December 23rd, and then a second time when we know that he did. For this theory to work, there had to be slipways along the bay that were easily accessible, and guess what? They are. And then the second time he headed out into the middle of the bay with no one in the boat. Well, he did that for plausible deniability. That's the one reason, but also to check that she hadn't risen to the surface. What we know for sure, though, is that one of the bloodhounds found traces of Laci at the Berkeley Marina, so it suggests she had to have passed through there, and this tends to support the notion that Scott took her there, out there, in the boat in broad daylight, as unlikely as it seems. And we know we were dealt with a similar scenario with Chris Watts, where it seemed so unlikely that he would take the children to the well site while they were still alive. Criminal psychology isn't always the same psychology of a normal human being. They don't necessarily think as logically, realistically, or rationally as we imagine that they might. In any event, I'm not going to take it further than that. The next analysis will focus on the aftermath to the discovery of Laci's body. What did Scott do? How did he react? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.